As we begin looking more closely at Buddhist art, we return to India. In an earlier lecture, I talked about the axial age. A number of religions were born in the centuries just before and after the term of millennium, at a time when traditional society was in some ways being transformed or even breaking down. In northwest India, at the time of the Buddha's birth in the 6th century BCE, increasingly powerful kingdoms were accumulating wealth and society was increasingly stratified along economic and caste lines. So the lives of ordinary people came under more and more strain, and the traditional religion was not meeting their needs. One response among the traditional Hindu Brahmins was solitary asceticism. Men seeking spiritual enlightenment and escape from samsara took up a life living alone as hermit in the woods. Another response was adopted by shramanas, or wandering beggars. They too sought liberation by leaving society, but rather than choosing a solitary path, they lived together in the forest with no caste differences as a spiritual community. The term Sangha would be adopted by Buddhists for communities of monks and nuns. After leaving his comfortable life as a young prince, and after exploring solitary asceticism, Siddhartha Gautama joined a Shramana group and transformed it by preaching a middle way that neither rejected nor embraced the desires of the body. He preached, as you'll recall, accepting then transcending suffering through wisdom, ethical conduct, including nonviolence, and mindfulness that came from meditation, self-discipline, and good deeds. The sum of these teaching was Dharma, or the law, usually represented as a wheel. The Dharma Chakra, or circle of Dharma, is probably the best-known symbol of Buddhism, and it shows up repeatedly in Buddhist iconography. Its overall shape is that of a circle or chakra representing the perfection of the Dharma teaching. The Dharma Chakra is associated with one of the many mudras, or symbolic hand gestures. Here you see a Buddha statue illustrating the Dharma Chakra mudra associated with Buddha's first sermon, or teaching. And here are a few of the most famous mudras. The Enlightenment, or witness mudra, shows Buddha pointing to the earth. This is the moment of Buddha's enlightenment. We didn't, alas, have time for a longer version of the Buddha biography. So here's a good part that we skipped. When the demon Mara attacked Siddhartha with armies of monsters, this is his temptation story, the demon asked the about-to-be Buddha, "Where are your witnesses?" Siddhartha reached out his right hand to touch the earth, and the earth itself roared, "I bear you witness." Mara disappeared, and that was the moment when Siddhartha realized enlightenment and became a Buddha. The no fear mudra conveys protection and security and remains popular for Buddha images placed in the home. And where else have you seen it? One of Shiva's 4 hands is raised in this mudra. You know what meditation is, right? It remains at the heart of Buddhist and Hindu religious practice. So just as Christianity would receive a big boost from the conversion of the Emperor Constantine, stay tuned, Buddhism began to spread dramatically when the great Mauryan ruler King Ashoka converted to Buddhism after he was filled with sorrow and horror at the death and suffering that was caused by one of his own military victories. He drew up a new legal code based on the Dharma and inscribed these laws on monolithic stone columns placed throughout his empire. This capital was placed at Sarnath, where the Buddha first preached about Dharma. The column holding the capital penetrated deep into the ground, connecting earth and sky and forming an axis of the universe. So note the lions stand on the Dharma Chakra, or wheel of the law. The 4 lions represent the 4 corners of the world, but they also, as is so often the case, represent Ashoka's power and majesty. Ashoka founded a number of important monasteries, and one of the greatest was at Sanchi in central India. The monastery complex included a number of buildings, but the most famous is the Great Stupa. While the stupas were probably modeled on earlier South Asian burial mounds, they are not tombs but reliquaries, built to house bits of the Buddha's body collected after his cremation. When the Buddha died, his remains were first collected in 8 reliquaries, but Ashoka sent relics to thousands of stupas all around his kingdom, and these became important pilgrimage sites. The Buddha's ashes were thought to have spiritual power, so by visiting and worshiping these relics, Buddhists would participate in the Buddha's enlightenment. So let's watch a clip from an Asian Art Museum video on South Asian Buddhist art. As you watch the video, pay special attention to how the Buddha is represented at Sanchi. The circular building is, of course, the stupa, but this gives you a better sense of how it belonged to a larger complex, including other stupas and numerous monastery buildings. This is a required College Board image, but the College Board image does not have these helpful labels. You need to learn some more terms, right? I'll talk about these in just a minute, but first, let me note that the stupa does not have a Pantheon-style open dome. The dome is completely filled with earth. This is a reliquary, really a tomb for the Buddha's remains. The main body of the stupa, the dome or anda, represents the world mountain, which rises through the center of the Buddhist universe. We've seen that before in Hindu architecture. The yasti, which rises through the top of the anda, symbolizes the axis mundi, the point at the center of the universe that connects heaven and earth. Some traditions of Buddhism also hold that it represents the Bodhi tree, under which the Buddha sought enlightenment. The 3 stone discs on the yasti represent the 3 jewels of Buddhism: the Buddha himself, Siddhartha, the Dharma, the law, and the Sangha, or monastic community. The yasti is surrounded by a small fence, or harmika. In Buddhist tradition, fences are used to gate off sacred areas. Remember how exclusivity is one of the features of a sacred space? These multi-level fences accentuate the separateness of the sacred space from regular worldly concerns. Pass the gate and you enter sanctified space. The part of the stupa surrounded by the harmika is a square area that represents the domain of the gods. Finally, there are 4 gateways leading into the stupa called toranas, which are aligned with the cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west. Passing through the gates, again, symbolize entry into a spiritual world. There we see that slide build, and sorry about the pause there. The stupa was likewise a site of ritual. Buddhists venerate the Buddha's remains through the ceremony of circumnavigation, walking around the stupa in a clockwise direction, following the path of the sun and creating harmony with the cosmos. The procession is also a communal act. Think of the procession depicted in the Parthenon. It's interesting to compare this with the spiritual journey of the early Christian pilgrim. The movement was linear, from narthex to apse, terms you'll encounter later, marking the movement from sin to salvation. By contrast, the Buddhist journey was circular, symbolizing the cycle of regeneration and the quest for nirvana, as well as the Buddhist belief that a circle represents perfection. But Christian pilgrimage churches also contained relics and built ambulatories so the pilgrims could more easily gain access to these relics. Stay tuned. The gateways open to the 4 cardinal directions from which the spiritual energy flows throughout the world. The gateway to the stupa is covered with friezes that depict stories from the Buddha's life and also from his past lives. The Buddha is represented by symbols: the lotus, the wheel, a riderless horse, an umbrella held above a throne, footprints, and the 3 jewels, which were symbolic of Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. As you saw in the video, one of the carved figures on the Torana is a Yakshi, an Indian goddess who represented fertility. Buddhists reinvented her to represent the Buddha's mother, Mara. Again, we see Hinduism reinterpreted, but also the way in which Hinduism and Buddhism coexisted in India. The woman and tree motif carried an added dimension of meaning due to a widely prevalent ancient belief that by her very touch, a woman could cause a tree to blossom or bear fruit. Again, note how deeply both Hinduism and Buddhism revere the creative power of women. We're going to see similar themes arise powerfully in Christianity with the veneration of Mary. Also, again, note the comfort with sensuality in Indian religious art, both Buddhist and Hindu. Buddhism, like Hinduism, regarded sexuality and spirituality as variant forms of a single fundamental cosmic force. This contrasts with Christianity, which, especially in the Middle Ages, was associated with a distrust of sensuality and a preference for monastic celibacy. Of course, Buddhism and Hinduism also have strong traditions of celibacy. And now we will finally move on to images of the Buddha, which is probably what most of you think of when you think of Buddhist art. First, let's watch this introduction to Indian images of the Buddha. Images of the Buddha did not appear for at least 400 years after his death, but as the video indicated, the demand for devotional objects eventually overwhelmed the aniconic impulse. This is the meditating Buddha. It is not a required work, but I want to talk about it a little bit anyway in order to introduce some of the iconography of the Buddhist representation and to introduce the culture that produced our next required image, the Buddhas of Bamiyan. Gandara was part of the Kushan Empire. It was located near overland trade routes and links to the ports on the Arabian Sea, and consequently its art incorporated Indian, Persian, and Greco-Roman styles brought to Central Asia by Alexander the Great. You can see the Greek stylistic influence in the facial features, in the curly hair, and the classical style of the costumes. Images of the Buddha and Bodhisattvas from Gandara somewhat resemble sculptures of Apollo, Athena, and other Greco-Roman gods. However, Buddhist sculptural drapery tends to be more symmetrical and regular, in keeping with the Buddha's serenity. The slide also shows some of the Buddha's characteristic iconography. The halo is common in depictions of the Buddha. Sometimes it's shown as a circle of light and sometimes as a flame. The Ushnisha, or top knot, symbolizes his role as a spiritual guide for his followers. The Orna is a third eye, symbolizing the Buddha's ability to see into the divine world. The Mudra, or hand gesture, of this Buddha is the meditation gesture. And now you see why I showed you another Gandaran image of the Buddha before we arrived at our required work, because our required work is gone. So let's watch a very short excerpt from a National Geographic video on the lost treasures of Afghanistan. It includes some footage of these Buddhas before they were destroyed. And here's a closer look at the colossal Buddha before its destruction. The smaller of the two destroyed Buddhas on the left is the Sakyamuni Buddha, or the historical Buddha, Siddhartha. By this point in Buddhist history, however, Buddhists were worshiping a wide range of manifestations of the Buddha, including the Buddha from his earlier lives and the Vairocana, or cosmic Buddha, the universal Buddha from whom all other Buddhas are seen as emanating. We're going to see another image, the Vairocana Buddha, when we move east to China in our next class. The Vairocana Buddha is your required work, by the way. The main bodies were hewn directly from the sandstone cliffs, but details were modeled in mud mixed with straw, coated with stucco. This coating, almost all of which wore away long ago, was then painted to enhance the expressions of the faces, hands, and folds of the robes. The larger one was painted a carmine red, and the smaller one was painted multiple colors. The statues had a troubled history even before the Taliban came along. Genghis Khan largely destroyed Bamiyan in 1221. He did spare the statues. A Persian emperor tried to blast them with cannon in the 1800s, and the face was taken off by an Afghan king during a rebellion. As this history suggests, motives for the attack have been twofold. On the one hand, Islam rejects images, and this is now an entirely Muslim region. But the Buddhas also came to represent the beauty, wealth, and political power of the Bamiyan Valley, and rulers attacking the valley attacked its most iconic images as well. You've seen this map before in my first lecture, and in my last lecture you learned that Buddhism spread as far east and west as the Khmer Empire. As far east and south. In my third and final lecture on Buddhism, I will talk about its spread east into China, Tibet, and Japan. To finish up today, however, let's head even further south and east to Indonesia and the spectacular temple of Borobudur. Southeast Asia, together with Sri Lanka and Tibet, is today the most Buddhist region in the world. The huge nation circled in green is Indonesia, and it's actually today a majority Muslim country. Borobudur is located on the island of Java, shown here. Java was another place where cultures came together. Most of the Javanese were devotees of the Hindu god Shiva, but they were also Buddhists. Like the Khmer, they deified their kings, identifying them as bodhisattvas, or divine beings who chose not to enter nirvana, but instead to stay behind to assist people on their path to enlightenment. I'm going to talk more about bodhisattvas in my final Buddhism lecture. One opportunity for spiritual growth was to support the king in constructing temples. In this way, the citizenry could earn religious merit and, one suspects, some political favor as well. Meanwhile, the kings demonstrated their piety, gained favor with the gods by erecting these monuments. The rulers of Central Java's Buddhist Salyender dynasty manifested the concept of the God King Deva Raja, remember the devas are gods, Raja is king, on a grand scale. During their rule, they constructed many religious monuments, the most famous of which is Borobudur. Consisting of 1.3 million stone blocks, it was carved and constructed by 50,000 Javanese workers over a 50-year span. It's 115 feet tall and sits atop a 403-foot square, so it is the largest Buddhist stupa in the world. To augment its grandeur, it's set upon a small plateau that rises 40 feet above the plain. So what we have is still another sacred mountain. This aerial view is one of the 3 required images of Borobudur. So let's introduce ourselves to this site with another UNESCO video. This aerial view is one of the 3 required images of, Hindu temples were meant to house the gods. Borobudur, by contrast, was not just meant as a memorial or shrine of the gods, but far more as an architectural representation of Buddhist philosophy. This diagram illustrates the worldview mapped in the temple, and what you just saw described in the video. Borobudur, like Angkor Wat, represents Mount Meru, the center of the Buddhist and Hindu universes. Borobudur is the ultimate diagram of the Buddhist cosmos and existence. Moving around it and ascending to its summit, pilgrims relived their own previous lives and those of the Buddha, and they could see what was coming in the future. They ascended from the human sphere of desire to the philosophical sphere of form, and finally arrived at the uppermost stupas, the sphere of formlessness, which symbolized the Buddha's ultimate achievement of nirvana. The base and the first 5 levels, which are rectangular, represent the terrestrial world. Reliefs on the ground level of the stupa illustrate the plight of mankind moving through endless cycles of birth, death, and reincarnation. The walls of the next 4 tiers show scenes from the life of the Buddha. The 3 round uppermost levels of the structure, remember round is the image of the shape of perfection, represent the celestial realm, and they support 72 stupas. Each of the stupas originally contained a statue of the preaching Buddha seated in a yoga position, and they surround the largest uppermost stupa. In the physical act of following the galleries clockwise around the monument, ascending upward, again from those reliefs representing the world of desire, past the stories of the Buddha who escaped from karma, to images such as Maitreya, the Buddha of the future, the devotees are following in the Buddha's footsteps. They also emerge from darkness into light, which makes this a contrast to some temples where worshippers delve even deeper into cave-like structures toward a dark inner sanctuary. The Buddha in the niches of the 5th balustrade level, 64 in all represent the Vairocana or cosmic Buddha, and they all form the same teaching Dharma Chakra Mudra. Here's just one of the carved narrative friezes that an ascending pilgrim would see, but it's one that the College Board picked out. It's from the stories of Buddha's life, so it's from the middle level, and it recounts the circumstances of the historical Buddha's birth. Queen Mara had a dream that an elephant had entered her womb. Actually, it was the Buddha in the shape of an elephant. During her pregnancy, the queen acquired certain powers, such as the power to heal diseases. Queen Mara asked the king to be allowed to give birth in the Lumbini pleasure garden. The queen set out for the garden in a carriage. That's the scene we see here. When she arrived, she walked until she came to an Ashoka tree, which magically bent down for her. She grasped the limb, and the Buddha emerged from her right side. Note the parasols, again, symbols of royalty. And by the way, this story will go all the way up to the Buddha receiving enlightenment in a continuous narrative frieze. Borobudur lay hidden for centuries under layers of volcanic ash and jungle growth. When and why it was abandoned remains a mystery. It was rediscovered in 1885 by employees of the Dutch East India Company, and it made a partial reconstruction. A major reconstruction was carried out under the auspices of UNESCO, the UN's cultural organization, in the 1970s, and then it was designated a World Historical Site. Buddhist worship has returned to the temple. Once a year during the full moon in May or June, Buddhists in Indonesia observe Vesak, which commemorates the birth, death, and the time when Siddhartha Gautama achieved the highest wisdom to become the Buddhist Sakyamuni. Although about 90% of Indonesians are now Muslim, Vesak is a national holiday in Indonesia. And now we will finish up our all-too-quick survey of Buddhist art with a trip to China, Tibet, and Japan.